Five of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome back to 5 of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films from this chosen year, and this video we're talking about the year 2017, so let's get started. Before we get into your top 5, here are the honourable mentions for this year. The Greatest Showman, Darkest Hour, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Kong Skull Island, Spider-Man Homecoming, Paddington 2, Dunkirk, It, Happy Death Day, War for the Planet of the Apes, Lady Bird, The Disaster Artist, and Blade Runner 2049. Now, let's get on to the list and start with Number 5. John Wick Chapter 2 is directed by Chad Stahelski and stars Keanu Reeves, Ian McShane and Ricardo Scamarcio. So to start off this list, let's start with the second entry, but let's talk overall about the truly great action franchise of this era of film, this decade and this time period, which is John Wick. Keanu Reeves, before this was obviously best known for The Matrix, other things like Speed and different things, but mainly The Matrix was his staple, and to argue still is. But to have another franchise that rivals that in a similar way, but in a different way, with similarities being there's a lot of installments of it, and with John Wick, at the time of recording this, there's been 4 films, and there's been spin-offs, and it could be more in the future. But for me, I find that John Wick as a franchise is truly, as I say, this generation's great action franchise. Unbelievably fantastic and enthralling action scenes throughout. The actions, the gunfighting, any kind of fighting, not just gun warfare, whether it be cars, whether it be pencils, whether it be dogs, you name it. The John Wick franchise as a whole brings some of the best action ever put to screen. And that dates all the way back to the great action heroes of years gone by. Things like Die Hard in, the 80s, the 70s, with Bruce Willis at his best. And of course that stands the test of time. But I feel that John Wick will in a similar way. And for Keanu Reeves to reinvent himself as this. Because let's be honest, in The Matrix, yes, he has some action scenes, but never to this level. And it's clear that he has such a dedication to the craft. You've probably seen those videos of him doing military drills and basically learning this art of warfare, this art of nearly like kung fu gunfighting. And as I say, every kind of fighting. But John Wick, and you're probably saying, well, why didn't he put John Wick 1 when he did 5 of the Best for 2014? And I remember mentioning that it was close. Obviously, it was the start of that great series and the start of this fantastic action franchise. But if you've been following the channel for a while, you'll know I've said that the John Wick franchise is probably one of the only instances where I feel they improve as the series progresses. Most films, and you would say nearly all films, they start with their strongest entry. Their sequel is decent, but never recaptures the magic as much, and then it continues until it falls off a cliff. There's countless examples of that. Terminator's maybe the best example, whereas, of course, the sequel is the best film in Terminator 2, but from that, and from Rise of the Machines onwards, it kind of continues to go downwards. Whereas, in John Wick, the first one is great, the second one, which we'll talk about today, is even better. And John Wick Chapter 2, it just dials it up. Whereas the first film feels quite confined. He's nearly like this boogeyman character that is just hunting or being hunted and the hunter becomes the huntee in that scenario. Whereas John Wick Chapter 2 widens the scale. It brings it to a larger scale, and it's clear that there's a wider picture going on of the lore of these films, the lore of this like Assassin's League and company and everything that they have to abide by, the rules that are set by the High Table, and everything about John Wick by the movies gets more engaging. And again, that's something that it gets more fleshed out as it goes, and it makes them better. You know, the second makes the first film better by that, the third makes the second better, and the first better, the fourth, and you know, whatever we're at now by the time you're watching this. John Wick is a fantastic action series. It's one of the most rewatchable action series, I feel, because you can just fire it on, and in about 2 minutes you'll find yourself hooked again. Like I was whenever I rewatched a few of these before I went and seen John Wick Chapter 4 this year, and they're all so good. The first film is great, and as I said at the time, it was unlucky not to make the top 5 that year, but John Wick Chapter 2 was definitely getting on for 2017. And this was where, you know, you find that where kind of the sequel is the make or break sometimes when it comes to franchises. And for John Wick Chapter 2, the first film is great, and I think we all kind of had that, oh, that was good, but that'll be it. You know, like a great one-off. Something like Nobody. You know, like a great film where you imagine if they did a sequel, it wouldn't be able to recapture that. I think with John Wick, they really knocked it out of the park with Chapter 2, and that was what enabled them to build it into this franchise and series that it's become. And with Chad Stahelski as the director, someone who is well versed in all of the action genre, the stunts and everything to it, he's the perfect director for all of these films and for the films that he did direct in this. And some of the performances, I mean, Keanu Reeves I've already mentioned, but Ricardo Scamarcio, I hope I'm saying that name right, as Santino D'Antonio in this, as the real first. Well, the first film, as I say, is quite grounded, and it feels like just a bit of a witch hunt for John Wick, and he turns the tables. This film, and through Ricardo Scamarcio's performance, brings the scale. It brings the, okay, this is not just a small affair, this is a worldwide, international scale that they're on. And in his character is Santino D'Antonio. I mean, I'm going to get these names wrong because there's that many. But he's the start, and where every villain in John Wick builds on, he is the building block, if you like. And while he isn't the greatest villain in the franchise, in my opinion, by this point, I do think he's one of the reasons that the epic scale of it is able to be transcended to the audience, to be conveyed to us, to go, okay, we get it. This is not just John Wick killing off 5 people near his house. This is a big deal. And another performance I always like to mention is Ian McShane, one of the most brilliant voices in film nowadays. I feel him as Winston in these films is also one of the great additions, and the scenario with the Continental. The John Wick films are so awesome. I don't want to go into too much details, but if you like your action films, you've probably seen any of them at some point. But yeah, I mean, I recommend John Wick Chapter 2. I recommend John Wick Chapter 1, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, and probably any other iterations they've made for this series, because they're fantastic. Number 4. Thor Ragnarok is directed by Taika Waititi and stars Chris Hemsworth, Tom Hiddleston, Mark Ruffalo, and Cate Blanchett. So 2017, 2018, 2019 is what I would like to class as, or I would class as, the truly great era of MCU films. Yes, there's a few stingers in here, things like Ant-Man and the Wasp 2, things like Captain Marvel isn't fantastic in my opinion, a few others like that. And even with Thor as a franchise, Thor Love and Thunder that followed this a little bit later in MCU after Endgame and everything, wasn't quite, I mean, I think I enjoyed that film a little bit more than some people did, but it's hard to deny it's certainly a step down from Ragnarok. And before that we had Thor and Thor the Dark World, who, I mean, in my opinion, the two of them, with the first Incredible Hulk in Phase 1, are 3 of the stinkiest and just worst Marvel films, never mind MCU films. And that's saying something, because Marvel has had some really bad ones. Really bad. But let's talk about the positives. And the positives for Thor Ragnarok are pretty much endless, because to really break the mold in this way is... It's what they do in this is they flip the script. And someone like Taika Waititi at the directing helm, of course, went on to things like Jojo Rabbit, which is fantastic, and I think we'll talk about when we get there in some capacity. Taika Waititi to turn Thor into a comedy character, and usually in any kind of genre, if a character is serious and it doesn't work to a great effect, I mean, Thor wasn't the worst character by any means in any of these films, but he certainly wasn't engaging, he certainly wasn't an exciting character. Whereas Thor Ragnarok, from basically the first scene, where he's stuck in the cage at the very start of the film, completely flips it. And he becomes a goofball, he becomes like the butt of the joke. Of course he's the god and he's this, so powerful being and everything. But for him to be so grounded in comedy, in a weird way, it was a really interesting take. And you would imagine, probably whenever I say that, he became the goofball and he became this, that would usually be a negative. But actually it's one of the greatest things about Thor Ragnarok. It completely reinvents Thor's character and makes him brilliant. And having him bouncing off, I mean, the two performances in this that really stand out to me alongside Chris Hemsworth's is Tom Hiddleston as Loki, who continues in that role to be far better than he should be. Loki is clearly, of course he was in the first Avengers film as the main bad at the time, but once he was disposed of, it seemed to me clear that was it for him. And he did pretty good in that role, but that was it. But every performance of his since the first Avengers has just built and built on that character. Of course he got his Disney Plus series and built on that character again. And Loki went from being one of the... He certainly wasn't on a level of Thanos or any of the better villains of the MCU. And for him to go and build on it so much and work on the character, a real testament to Tom Hiddleston. And he's really made a fan out of me as performances. And Mark Ruffalo, yes, he's good in this, but I think he has had better outings in the MCU. But this is one of his better ones, for sure. But in the villain, to have someone of the quality of Cate Blanchett, to have a villain of that caliber, Cate Blanchett, undoubtedly one of the most fantastic actresses working today. She is absolutely fantastic in nearly everything, and she brings so much to this. You can tell she's having fun with the role. It's not as serious as a lot of her roles, her Oscar wins and things like that. This is certainly not that, but you can tell that she's in this role, she's thriving in this role, she's enjoying it, and that comes across so well. And to see her kind of stepping out of her shell a little bit in a weird way, because she has such range. She has one of the best ranges of any actress, but for her to come into this and just like a duck to water, she's just straight in and fantastic. And her dynamic between as the main villain against our hero and our babbling hero in Chris Hemsworth. Of course there's other performances. Tessa Thompson also really shows up in this film for the first time and is great. People like Jeff Goldblum bring so much to this. There is so much to love in Thor Ragnarok, but the simple fact, and take away all the performances and take away everything, what this does, and what Taika Waititi does in this, is reinvigorates one of the best characters. Because at this point, Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man and Chris Evans as Captain America were so far superior, were so much more engaging as a character to the audience. And they brought Chris Hemsworth as Thor up. Maybe not to their level, but not the big disparity it was before. Thor Ragnarok it's definitely a top 5 MCU film at this point. There's, of course, Infinity War is not too long after this, and of course we'll chat about that. But Thor Ragnarok always, whenever I look back at this, and I would class this as the golden era of the MCU, because I think Of course, it's fell off a cliff a little bit in this last while. Of course, there's been some shining lights, but there hasn't been a consistent pattern of quality. This time, I look back so fondly on movies like Thor Ragnarok, movies like Infinity War and Endgame, and movies like Civil War even, or... I mean, the list goes on. The list goes on. There's so many around this time, but Thor Ragnarok in particular really stands above a lot of them. The comedy is fantastic. There's some brilliant moments throughout this. There's some brilliant action moments. It's a brilliant blend of seriousness along with comedy. And that isn't always done so well, especially in Marvel films. This is one of the best, if not the best example of it being done perfectly, which is blending comedic moments, blending, having a funny scene and having a funny quip by a character. Sometimes the tone can be all over the place with Marvel, especially in some of the later iterations and closer to the time of filming. But with Thor Ragnarok, it's exactly what it needs to be in all marks. What it does for the characters, what it does for the franchise, building up the severity of Infinity War, which is to come. Thor Ragnarok is brilliant. It's brilliant. It's always been, ever since I've seen it, it's always been one of my favourite MCU films, and it will continue to be, because I don't think there'll be a film like it. It's like in the similar way that Civil War is like a mini Avengers film, this is a similar way. In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. But overall, Thor Ragnarok is a brilliant time. And if you're wanting a quick skim through of the best of the MCU, Thor Ragnarok is a must watch. You have to see this one. If you're going through just the ones that you think you'll enjoy and leaving out the ones that are unnecessary, Thor Ragnarok is absolutely a necessity to see.
Number 3.
Get Out is directed by Jordan Peele and stars Daniel Kaluuya and Alison Williams. Now, when I spoke there about smart writing and films being exactly what they need to be, we're on another level to that. Because while Ragnarok is smartly written and has what I've just said there, the good points, Get Out is as smartly a written film I have seen in a long time. And even to this point now, a lot of years later, Get Out continues to be and stands out in my head as one of the finest horror movies, thriller movies, suspenseful movies. So many different factors, but everything about Get Out is it's in some ways so distressing and so disturbing, and in some ways it's so much of a it's one of those films it's so hard to start talking about because I feel like I'll never stop. Let's start with the performances. Let's start with something that we can build on. And let's start with Daniel Kaluuya. Of course, now, someone who has been in so many things. But before Get Out, wasn't really a household name, but certainly is now. And the reason is, he is simply fantastic. If we're casting this film as a horror, Get Out is purely Daniel Kaluuya as our main guy, if you like. In the same way as some films you would have the final girl, as Daniel Kaluuya as our final guy, if you like, if that's even the right term. He is one of my favourite characters in horror as Chris. He is... The scenario that he is put in is so horrific. And I suppose that's something that we should really touch on. It's... Of course, I'm a white man. I have no way could ever understand. But as an onlooker, and seeing this conveyance of racism in such a highly subtle way, if you like. Of course, there's the crux of the film. There's the point, and there's the reason we're here. And yes, it's purely racially motivated, and it is so. It's so rough. It's so hurtful. It's so brutal. But it's also everything else in the film. It's the little things on a rewatch that you get and you go, oh my god, that is so smartly done. And I find myself on the first watch nearly in awe of this. And in Jordan Peele, of course, written and directed by Jordan Peele, not just directed. And of course he had his films after, which is Us, with Lupita Nyong'o, and of course Nope in more recent times. And of course I've enjoyed them to varying degrees, but I think something that nobody can really deny, I mean, some people would argue some of the other ones, but Get Out is so far above those other two films. I enjoyed Us and I didn't really like Nope, but Get Out is just fantastic. Fantastic for what it is. And it really put Jordan Peele as, you know, him along with people like Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, you know, a lot of these kind of up-and-coming directors who are doing their own thing. They're not making these giant franchises, like I was talking about with Marvel there. These bigger franchises, they're basically allowed to do their own thing and tell these, whether they be dark stories, whether they be wacky stories, whether they be so outlandish or so grounded. And with Get Out, yes, there's the kind of the outlandish nature of the sunken place in this. I was going to say the Upside Down, Stranger Things. Now, the sunken place in this film, which is one of the scariest, I think, concepts in a horror movie that I can think in recent memory. Something new that is instantly a staple. And it's one of those films, and I know we've talked about this before, about sequels, and does a sequel really take away from, you know, the original? But if there's one film I hope never gets a sequel, it's this. This and a few others that come to mind, I just think are perfect for what they are. And then Alison Williams as the girlfriend in the film, if you like, she is fantastic. I mean, I can't say too much without giving away too much. It is one of those films where once the truth unfolds, and when it does, it completely takes you from left field, and now you go for this completely different angle. Of course, you have inclinations of what is going on, but once you're in, about halfway through the film, maybe, you know, a third of the way through the film, and once you really know what is happening in Get Out, you're hooked. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't find the quality in Get Out. Jordan Peele, as I say, is one of those directors who, I mean, I didn't enjoy the film Nope, but I could clearly see there was a vision for him, and I love that. Robert Eggers, I said, is another director who, I mean, you talk to, it's one of those films where people, or one of those directors where their films are so, maybe divisive is the word? Maybe as not as much in the case of Jordan Peele as it would be with someone like a Robert Eggers, or even an Ari Aster. But for Jordan Peele in particular, to have this genre, I'm going to say it, I think he's the most exciting director in horror today. Even with Nope not being my cup of tea, really, I think with Get Out and Us and whatever comes next, I know there was a film, was it Antebellum, with Janelle Monáe. Wasn't really fussed on that too, but I think with Get Out and Us, he really does have that credibility behind him. And until he becomes like a Shyamalan, which I really hope not, where it becomes, you know, one good in 3, maybe one good in 5 films, whereas Shyamalan at his prime was, you know, banger after banger after banger. I think with Jordan Peele, Get Out might always be his greatest film. And that's okay, because it is fantastic. Get Out is just, if you love your horror, if you love your subtle horror, if you love things that touch on really sensitive topics, but topics that need to be talked about, Get Out is everything it needed to be, and so much more. Get Out is fantastic. It's one of the better horror films in the last 10 years for sure. Number 2. Logan is directed by James Mangold and stars Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart, and Daphne Keane. Now, I would imagine if you're looking at 2017, you probably had Logan at number 1 if you've seen it. When we talk about number 1, I'll explain why it was above it for me, but, and I know I've said this a few times, and you're probably sick of hearing me say this if you're following the series, but Logan on any other year is probably number 1. Because Logan is quite simply one of the best comic book films ever. Full stop, next question. Because this film is something special. It's so much more than just a comic book film, and I don't mean that as derogatory as it sounds, but Logan is truly a fantastic film. Not a fantastic superhero film, not a fantastic comic book film, a fantastic film. Logan is so much better than it has any right to be. And here's the greatest credit I can give it. Prior to Logan, I had seen one X-Men movie. Bar like Deadpool or whatever. The only film I had seen of Logan, or Wolverine, or this character, was X-Men Days of Future Past, which I'll admit wasn't too bad. I enjoyed it. Did I love it? No. But I was never one that grew up with the X-Men franchise. I was never one that loved a lot of these characters. And in truth, I still haven't seen a lot of the films of X-Men, especially the earlier ones around the year 2000. So I was not coming into this as a die-hard Wolverine fan, X-Men fan, whatever. Even the other films around that time, even the kind of reboot, which was like an X-Men First Class, The Wolverine, a few of those films which I know came to kind of mixed success. A lot of people enjoyed those films, a lot of people weren't so as fussed on them. I know The Wolverine didn't do that great. But then Logan comes along. And I'll admit, I wasn't for planning to see this film. I had heard good things, but I wasn't really a die-hard movie guy the way I would be now. So when it came to Logan coming out, it was actually one of my friends said, "Come on, we're all going to see Logan." And I went, well, I'm not. Do I need to see the other ones, or will I just go? He says, "You probably don't, but just give it a go." I walked out of that cinema screen after seeing Logan, and I thought that is simply one of my favourite films I had seen in years at the time. It was just amazing. And performances-wise, someone like Patrick Stewart in particular, like obviously we'll talk about Hugh Jackman and Daphne Keane, who are two core, and I'll about to wax lyrical about them, so don't worry about that. But I want to talk about Sir Patrick Stewart first, because for him as Charles Xavier, again, I'm not the most versed with the character, I'm not the most versed with the X-Men lore and the universe and everything. But what I will say is he puts in one of the most fantastic performances I've seen from him ever in Logan, as this frail and almost defeated character who, through the X-Men universe, of course, I mean, he's like the leader, isn't that right? He's like the leader of the X-Men, and for him to have all the power, essentially, quite literally, for him to have all the power and to then become this frail, and to be almost more engaging without his powers, or without him at full strength, I should say. Patrick Stewart is amazing in this. And the other performance, before we get to our main man, and we'll get there, is Daphne Keane as young Laura in this film, as Hugh Jackman's adopted daughter. And that seems to be a trope that's really popular nowadays. We've had things like The Last of Us, which of course, on both the video game side and on the television adaptation, which is one of the best father and adopted daughter dynamics. We've had things like The Witcher, which with Geralt and Ciri, which is another adopted daughter, and something like The Road with Viggo Mortensen. There's so many films that have this kind of father, or well, maybe not films, just media. But what I will say is Logan, with Hugh Jackman and Daphne Keane as Logan and Laura, is one of the most beautiful tellings of the story. Because it's so simplistic. There isn't a whole lot of dialogue between them. A lot of it is more Logan's side than it is Laura. Daphne Keane actually doesn't say there isn't a whole lot of dialogue from her throughout this film. In fact, there's very little. But what she does is and especially for such a young actress, to convey so much and tell so much of a story with just her actions and not with her dialogue, not with her voice, is a real testament to her. Her performance is as good as Hugh Jackman's in this, and that is saying something, because Hugh Jackman, you heard me wax lyrical about him when we talked about something like Prisoners, which I do think is his best performance, but Logan is like, if we're talking 100 out of 100 for Prisoners, Logan is like 98 out of 100 when you're talking about scale of performances, because he is, amazing. Amazing. This film is amazing. I love this, and it's one of those films I actually save. I leave a little bit of time before rewatching it. I watched it that first time in the cinema. I loved it so much. I went, you know what? I want to save a bit of time and rewatch that. And then over, maybe it was about 2020, I rewatched it and I went, oh my god, this movie is absolutely fantastic. It just is. And to be honest, as I've said, the film in the number one spot for today's video is a film I just love more because it's one of my favourites ever, and we'll get there. But Logan is undoubtedly a top 3 superhero movie, comic book movie. Might even be a top 2. It is absolutely fantastic. And again, it's not like it's the MCU where I've been along for the ride with these 20 films for these characters. Or even, as I say, with you guys, maybe when you've seen Logan, you've watched all the X-Men movies up to it. So I can imagine it connects to you even more than it does to me. So that says, and that's a real testament to how much quality this film has. It's so much better than it has any right to be, Logan. The action scenes are so brutal. It's a hard-hitting film. Not just emotionally, but physically. I mean, there's some real brutal moments in this. Of course, the dynamic with Hugh Jackman multiplied. There's so much to Logan. I don't want to even talk about any plot points. Just once you finish this video, and of course, I'll probably say the same when we get finished and talking about the first in the list. But Logan is so fantastic. And let's talk about number 1. But don't ever think that Logan is not great. Don't ever think that just because number one is a personal preference for me that just hit the right mark. But Logan is definitely a film that any other year, and you probably think, he says that all the time. Trust me. This, more than most, Logan would be number 1 any other year. But it's not number 1 today. Because my number 1 is number 1. Baby Driver is directed by Edgar Wright and stars Ansel Elgort, Lily James, and John Hamm. So when I said about personal preference, I meant it. Baby Driver is one of my top 10 films of all time. That's how I'm starting this, and that's why it's above Logan. That's why. Now, Baby Driver I would imagine is an acquired taste. I would imagine it's a film that you may enjoy, you may not enjoy. But do you know when you hear people say about, it's like this movie was made for me? Baby Driver is that. And of course, you might say, oh, well, some of the cast have been in the news, let's say. Take that aside. And you know me, I'm here to talk about the movies. I'm not here to talk about drama. I'm not TMZ. Couldn't give a toss about all that stuff. What I want is good performances, movies that stand the test of time. Are they tainted by some of that stuff? A little bit. But not in the case of Baby Driver. I will always love this film. And why is that? What are the reasons why? Well, for the many ones that I can think of, let's start with the main reason. The main reason is the director, Mr. Edgar Wright. Now, you have heard me talk and wax lyrical about Edgar Wright if you've been following the series on multiple occasions, particularly in the Cornetto trilogy, especially with Shaun of the Dead and especially with Hot Fuzz. Edgar Wright is simply put one of my favourite directors working today. Not every film connects the same way, not every film I love the most, but Baby Driver is my favourite of his. Now, you might say, above Shaun of the Dead, above Hot Fuzz? Listen, if you want to go back to those episodes of Five of the Best, you'll know how much I love them both. And that shows how much I adore this film. I think everyone is doing such a good job. Ansel Elgort in the main role is, as Baby, is... I mean, I've only ever seen him in one other thing, which is West Side Story. I don't know too much about him as an actor. Of course, as I said, news-wise, not interested. But when it comes to just pure main character energy, again, I said this a little bit when I was talking about Logan there. A lot of it isn't his dialogue. A lot of it's the performances around him. People like John Bernthal, people like John Hamm, people like Isa Gonzalez, and in particular, someone like Lily James, who I just find... Do you know, I'm going to go a bit off the script here. And there isn't even a script. I'm just sitting looking at a wall while I'm talking to you here. But when it comes to I just love this. I just love Baby Driver. I could talk about this performance is really good and that's why I did this and this dialogue's this and blah blah. I just love this film. You know when you get that with some movies? And again, I get that maybe you wouldn't like Baby. You probably would enjoy Logan more. And I wouldn't hold that against you. But I just find that there's certain movies that just stand out to me. And there's been a few that have been on 5 of the best. A few that, you know, the movie you would think would be movie of the year for me ends up in 2nd or 3rd place. And number 1 is a certain film you go, oh, that's a bit off left field. I imagine Baby Driver's probably the best example of that for this year. There's a few in the honourable mentions that we'll get talking about that you probably think, oh, I thought that would definitely be in this top 5. But I have to say that Baby Driver, ever since I've seen it, and I've now watched it about 10 times, maybe more than 10 times since, I think I love it more on rewatches. His use of music, and I've said that before when I talked about Edgar Wright, his use of music and how much he can amplify a movie by music. Baby Driver is one of the best examples of that. This movie is littered with amazing musical moments throughout. Of course, the dynamic of Baby having the hearing issue, and then he has the headphones, and that plays into most scenes, and the driving with it. I just, you know, talking about this now makes me want to go watch Baby Driver again for the whatever amount of times. It's just one of those films that I just think I'll always love. It just hits the right mark for me. And I love it. I love it for what it is. Ever since I've seen it, it was one of those ones, and a bit like what I was talking about there with Logan and a few of the other ones we mentioned today, which was, I loved it, but then on a rewatch, I adored it. And then when I continue to rewatch it, I continue to adore it. It wasn't like, do you know when you get those films where you watch them once and you're like, oh, that was so good, I can't wait to watch it again. And then you get home, and then you buy it on Blu-ray or 4K or whatever, and then you put it in, and then you go, actually, this isn't very good. I don't know why I liked it that much. Baby Driver's like the opposite for me. Seeing it in the cinema is like, and I went with a group of friends to see it, and I think there must have been about 6 or 8 of us or something, and everyone collectively went, that was so good. But it was only on the rewatch where I was like, okay, this is top tier for me. Again, might not be completely your cup of tea, might not be your favourite film or whatever, but I think Baby Driver will always be one of mine. It's definitely a top 20 for me. I'm pretty sure it's a top 10 for me. And it probably will continue to be. That all rhymed? My goodness. But yeah, Baby Driver, I'll be honest, 2017, and you know, we get in this when we're doing our summary, but 2017 is one of the strongest years in memory for me when it comes to movies. You can tell by the honourable mention there was a lot. But the only thing that was undoubted, the only thing that never changed, and the thing that I never doubted, was what number 1 was in this year. And 2, for that matter, with Logan. But I always knew that Baby Driver was my favourite film of 2017. And therefore, Baby Driver is my favourite film of the year 2017. So yeah, 2017, one of my favourite years of film to date, really. I mentioned a few years back in one of the summaries about there was a few years coming up that really stand out to me. 2017 is definitely one of them. So let's talk about the honourable mentions, and let's get the elephant out of the room. You've probably been waiting since the honourable mentions to go, why is that not in his top 5? Why is that not number 1? Why is that not number 2 or 3 or whatever? Why is Blade Runner 2049 not in his top 5? Now, I have said this a few times on this. A few honourable mentions films, something like The Revenant was another example. Certain films that I see, and there's been a few over the years that have been in the honourable mentions, and you probably think to yourself, how the hell is that not in his top 5 in some capacity? Why is John Wick Chapter 2 and Thor Ragnarok over Blade Runner 2049? One of the best spectacles. Denis Villeneuve is one of his great... I just think it's fine, guys. I enjoy it. I thought it was good. It's probably like an 8 out of 10 film for me. But, and this is maybe controversial because so many people have said the opposite, but I rewatched the first Blade Runner not that long ago, and I think it's better. And I know that's really controversial, and of course, you know, the CGI is a little bit dated and whatever, but I think I just preferred the first film, the original with Harrison Ford. And once I got that into my head, I went, well, if that's the case, and I don't even know if the first Blade Runner would have got into that top 5, because I preferred those 5 films. Therefore, that's why it made honourable mentions. Is it close to getting into the top 5? Yes. Is it the closest of all the honourable mentions to getting in the top 5? No, actually. Because there's 3 films that I think are closer. The first is It Chapter 1. Now, It Chapter 2 is too long. It's pretty good, but it's too long, and it's not for rewatches. It Chapter 1 is one of the better horror movies of this time. And it's between it and the other 2 that rival John Wick Chapter 2 for the 5th spot here. I think Pennywise, Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, is one of the great horror performances. I talked a little bit about this when I was talking about Get Out, about great horror performances. This was a good year for horror, definitely. One of the most memorable that I can think of. To have It Chapter 1 and Get Out in the same year, it's just the creme de la creme when it comes to horrors and memorable horror films. So It was pretty close. Paddington 2. Oh, that wee bear. Wee Paddington 2. Paddington 2 is one of the greatest kids films, family films, whatever genre you want to put that in. It is so much better than it has any right to be. Paddington 1 is good, but Paddington 2 is a joke how good it is. Now, it's maybe not my, what would you say? It's not my kind of movie, but even I have to say, it's undeniable how can Paddington 2 be that good? Seriously, how is Paddington 2 able to bring that much emotion, that much heart, that much care for a film about a little bear with... Paddington 2 is great. And the last film is one that you may or may not have seen, which is Lady Bird with Saoirse Ronan. Lady Bird is one of the best acted films in recent memory, and especially from her. That was where Saoirse Ronan for me became, before it was like, okay, well, she's up and coming and whatever. She is a full-blown superstar after Lady Bird. And while maybe there hasn't been a performance for her since that I can think of recently that has eclipsed that for her, Lady Bird is a fantastic film. Beautiful at moments, emotional throughout. Lady Bird is a pretty special film. I didn't love it as much as the top 5, and that's why the top 5 were the top 5. But yeah, this year is just an awesome year. And even with, the other honourable mentions, a lot of them would have got in. It just is a really, really strong year. There's about one more year before we get up to the present day that is like this level of strength with that many honourable mentions. Actually, I think it has even more. So it's a few years down the line. There's 1 or 2 more years that are just the creme de la creme. I think I've said that twice today. But yeah, 2017's a great year. And you're probably thinking, why does he always say that? But in this case, it is absolutely true. I'm not waffling this time. 2017 is a fantastic year of cinema, of film. To be a movie fan, it was one of the best and one of the most memorable because you had so many things that started and got built on. You had something like Guardians 2, which I felt was a brilliant continuation. Maybe some people didn't love it as much as the first. I thought it was a bit inferior to the first, but great in a different way, more emotional. Things like The Greatest Showman, things like War for the Planet of the Apes, the finality of that brilliant trilogy that I didn't really get chatting about much over the 5 of the best. Something like Darkest Hour. Something like... there's so many. And then the ones we've talked about. John Wick getting its continuation. One of the better MCU films in Thor. Get Out, one of the staples of horror of this generation. Logan as a top 3 comic book movie ever. And Baby Driver as just a film for me personally, I just adore. Maybe if you were doing your top 5, it could be very different. It might be none of the 5 I've picked, and it could be a lot of the honourable mentions. Who knows? But overall, 2017 is it's an awesome year. It's a year I look back with such love and such fondness for, and it's one that will always stick in my mind. And next year is also a really good one. that'll be next month. So anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to me talking about some movies and a great year. If you want to stick around, leave a like, let me know you enjoyed this one. Subscribe and hit the bell for more. As I say, it's an ongoing series until we get up to present day, and it will continue all the way through. So if you want to stick around, I'd appreciate you so much for it. And if you do, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love everyone.